We now have a test to make sure that people are allowed to contribute money and get them marked as an approver. We also have a test to make sure that we have a minimum contribution limit on our campaign as well. For our next test, I think we should start to move forward in functionality. In particular, I want to write a test that asserts that a manager has the ability to create a payment request. For this test, we're not going to try to actually approve or vote it or finalize it or anything like that. We're just going to say that we have the ability to make a request. So let's add on a new it statement. We'll mark this one as it allows a manager to make a payment request. This one is not going to be that bad. Remember that tied to our contract, so here's our campaign contract right here, we have a function called createRequest. We can call createRequest and pass in a description, a value, and an address. And that should basically make the request and add it to our requests array. So as step one, I think we need to call the createRequest function and pass in these required arguments. So back inside of our test file, we'll write out await campaign.methods, and we want to call createRequest. CreateRequest is going to have several different arguments being passed to it. So just to make sure that everything is nice and legible for you to see it, I'm going to put this on a new line like so, rather than having this run all the way over to the right-hand side. So the first argument to createRequest is supposed to be a string description. So I will give it a string description of how about buy batteries. Like I need to buy batteries to make this Kickstarter campaign or whatever it might be. As the second argument, we'll pass in our value. So that's as a string 100, indicating 100 way. And then as a third argument, we have to pass in an address. We're not going to actually use this address to send any money to this account or anything like that. We just have to make sure that we provide an address in general. So as an address, let's just toss in accounts at 1. And of course, don't forget, I can't say it enough, and I know you're probably very tired of me saying it, don't forget to call send, because this is a function that it's going to attempt to modify our contract's data. We have to specify who is sending in this transaction, of course. The entire point of this test is to say that the manager is allowed to make payment requests, so we should definitely use the manager address, which is accounts at 0. And then as usual, we will also specify our gas. And let's remove our commas. All right, so that's going to make our request. Remember that anytime we send a transaction to a function, we get absolutely no return value back. So now we have to reach back into our contract after this thing is created and pull out the request that was just made. As usual, this is another thing that I'm sure you're tired of me saying. We made that request array to store our request. It is marked as public. That means that we automatically get a request function created for us. One thing to keep in mind here is that array getter functions that are synthesized for us are only used to retrieve one element at a time. Because inside of our test file right here, we have not created any requests previously, that means that we should try to get the request at index of 0 from this array, because the one that we just made should be the first request in that array. So back inside of our test file, we can get that request that was just created by saying const request is await campaign.methods.requests. So this is our automatically generated getter for the array, and we need to specify the index that we want to retrieve from it. So I want index at 0. And as usual, we are not modifying any data, so we'll use .call. All right, so this is going to return our request. Remember, inside of our contract, a request is a struct, and a struct is a collection of key value pairs. So that request object that we just got back from that call should have a property description, value, recipient complete, and approval count. It does not have an approvals method, or excuse me, an approvals property, however, because remember, whenever we try to retrieve a mapping, we can't get the whole thing. Like we can't get everything out of a mapping. We can ask for individual values, but we cannot attempt to retrieve everything out of it in one go. So we have access to only these first 5 properties. Now for the purposes of our test, we probably don't need to make an assertion about every single property of the request. So I'm just going to write one assertion, and I'm going to make sure that the description property of the request was set properly. So I will say assert equal, and I want this to be equal to buy batteries. And then as a second argument, I'm going to place the actual value, which is request.description, like so. Of course, if we wanted to, we could reference some of the other properties on the request, but again, we can just check for one and have reasonable a belief that, yeah, if this is set correctly, chances are everything else is too. All right, so let's now run this test. At the command line, we'll do the usual npm run test. And we've got another test passing. Very good. All right, just 1 or 2 more tests. So let's take a pause here and continue in the next video.